Okay. The title of my paper is the passage dealing with when the bridegroom is taken away. This is a passage in the handouts you have. I've given the three occasions it shows up in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Embedded within the pericope of the narrative there of the question about fasting are indications of a variance in attitude and practice between the movement of the Baptist and Jesus and his followers. I'm going to suggest that a careful philological, historical investigation of the saying can help us to discern the sense of the episode within the context of Jewish life and thought in the closing days of the Second Temple. There are a number of questions which we don't have time really to address today regarding the framework, the historical framework of this, questions of who's asking and what precisely is the question. It varies in each one. Again, that would sort of take us to the side. We'd be going into lunchtime, which I don't want to do. But in any event, the usual assumption regarding the question about John's disciples is that the assumption is that the actions of John's disciples should be interpreted in the light of customary Jewish religious practice, and consequently, an artificial contrast is created between Jewish piety of the first century as represented by John and his disciples, and Jesus' instruction to his disciples. Continuing on this line of thought, scholarship has suggested that the aim of our saying is to explain why the church fasted when Jesus' first disciples did not. Yet, the supposed ecclesiastical impetus relies upon the questionable assumption that Jesus' disciples never fasted. According to Luke, the questioners do not claim that Jesus' disciples never fast, nor is there a hint in any of the remaining references to the fasting in the New Testament which would indicate a discontinuity between Jesus and his disciples and the later adherents to the Christian faith. Finally, the assumption that Jesus forbade fasting by his disciples is controverted by his instruction in the Sermon on the Mount, "When you fast." A pivotal point for our understanding of the significance of the fasting by John's disciples and why Jesus rejected it is the identity of the bridegroom. Those who suggest that Jesus forbade fasting until his death generally assume that the figure of the bridegroom was intended to represent the Messiah. The implication in this saying is that this saying is another passion prediction, betraying Jesus' messianic self-awareness and therefore historically questionable. As is frequently noted, however, the metaphorical use of the bridegroom for the Messiah is absent both in the Hebrew Bible and early Judaism. Unfortunately, the suggestions that have thus far been put forward by New Testament scholarship have suffered from their need to disintegrate the literary structure of the episode, their disregard of contradictory evidence elsewhere in the Gospels and the New Testament, and their lack of any clear Jewish parallels to justify a messianic interpretation of the bridegroom. In this study, I've tried to demonstrate that this confusion to a large extent is a product of two incorrect assumptions, which in the light of recent discoveries can now be clarified. One, the nature and purpose of the fasting by John's followers, and Jesus' intended use of the bridegroom. First, the question of John and his fasting. And according to Luke's gospel, again, John's disciples fast often. What was the motivation for the frequent fasting on the part of the Baptist disciples? If their asceticism was simply an example of the type of Jewish piety reflected in Luke 18:12 and the Didache 8:1, then Jesus' words might indicate a rejection of the contemporary forms of religious devotion. As we'll see, however, there are indications that the fasting by the Baptist followers were not mere piety, but a visible expression of an extraordinarily pessimistic attitude towards the present situation. The Matthean version of Jesus' answer presents a variant reading that hints to the broader issues that underlie the fasting by John's disciples. According to this narrative, Jesus asks, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The question echoes Jesus' testimony concerning John, found on another occasion, which I've given to you in the handout. We piped to you, you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. This childish parody chastens the people's rejection of the prophetic message, no matter what form it took. Jesus portrays them as spoiled children. What is important for our study is the contrast presented in the form of the message delivered by John and Jesus. John came in penitence and mourning, neither eating nor drinking, and the populace criticized him for his excessive severity. We piped to you and you did not dance. Jesus' message was marked by its absence of ascetic austerity, and they accused him of being a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. The contrast provides an important interpretation for the ascetic life of John of the Baptist and the reason for the fasting on the part of his disciples. John's mournful asceticism resembles other groups and individuals mentioned in the historical sources who lived in the decades leading up to the destruction of the temple. Rabbinic literature records an exceptional example set by Rabbi Tzadok, who fasted for 40 years prior to the Jewish revolt against Rome. He recognized the signs of impending doom and fasted continuously in the hope of diverting disaster. In additional facets of communal lifestyle of the Essenes described by Josephus, they correspond to the Jewish requirements for fasting. The historian mentions that the relative quiet among the members of the community was, quote, in fact due to the limitation of their allotted portions of meat and drink and demands of nature, their continual abstinence. So it seems like they were on sort of a slow, semi-fast in terms of their lifestyle. His description resembles the fragmentary evidence from the Qumran library, suggesting that at least some among the Dead Sea community and those associated with the fringes of their movement lamented because of the spiritual condition of the nation and the inevitable consequences. Both the Baptists and the Qumran congregation saw judgment to be imminent. Others also shared their critical views of the temple establishment. Many anticipated the removal of the Second Temple. In 1st Enoch, the present ancient temple is replaced by a new one. This future temple is described in utopian terms. A house shall be built for the great king in glory forevermore. 1st Enoch 91, 11 through 13. The hope for a pure eschatological temple parallels the Qumran expectation that we hear in 4Q 174. This is the house which he will build for them in the last days, as is written in the book of Moses, in the sanctuary which thy hands have established, O Lord, the Lord shall reign forever and ever. Thus, references to mourning perhaps should be viewed as a response to the apostasy by the present priestly establishment and the anticipated dire consequences for the nation. In the apostrophe to Zion, reflects, another Qumran document, reflects sentiments of the circles to which Simeon in Luke 2:25 and Anna, Luke 2:36 through 38, are identified already in the beginning of the New Testament period. The attitudes of the Hebrew poem also portray the religious provenance out of which the movement of the Baptist evolved. The apostrophe is addressed to Zion, and in its opening strophe, it assures the holy city of her future glory. Generation after generation will dwell in thee, and generations of saints will be thy splendor. For those who yearn for the day of thy salvation, that they may rejoice in the greatness of thy glory. A few lines later, however, the writer describes the present period of wickedness and the hope for the pure ones, for God's imminent salvation. The merits of thy prophets will thou remember, and in the deeds of thy pious ones will thou glory. Purge violence from thy midst, falsehood and evil will be cut off from thee. Thy sons will rejoice in the midst, and thy precious ones will be united with thee. How they have hoped for salvation, thy pure ones have mourned for thee. The language is biblical and reflects the style of apostrophes to Zion in Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 62, 1 through 8. Attention should be paid to the use of the epithet pious ones, chasidecha, and the reference to their mourning. Both the pious ones in the apostrophe and the two mentioned in Luke's infancy narrative both look for the redemption or the liberation of Jerusalem. Each of the individuals and groups demonstrate a common attitude and expectation. The pure ones from the community mourned for Jerusalem. Anna remained in the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer day and night, looking for the redemption of the holy city. Simeon found in the temple, waiting for the consolation of Israel. To the mourners of Zion, language drawn from Isaiah 61:3, such as these, Jesus may have offered his words of encouragement in Matthew 5:4, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be consoled." A lament concerning the present spiritual conditions of Zion and the recognition of impending judgment is heard also in the Qumran Katina and in the apocryphal lamentation from Cave 4. During the present dominion of Belial, the lot of light is in mourning. Again, this is drawing from, on your handout, Numbers 8 and 9. How lonely sits the city, princess of all nations is desolate like an abandoned woman, and all her daughters are abandoned. A woman forsaken like a woman grieved, and like a wife abandoned by her husband. All her palaces and her walls are like barren women, and all her paths are like a woman shut away. Like an embittered woman, and all her daughters are like women mourning for their husbands. Like women bereaved of their only children, Jerusalem shall weep. The writer draws his words from one of the biblical apostrophes to Zion, Isaiah 54:6 and Lamentation 1:1, to present Jerusalem as a city desolate and abandoned. In the apocryphal lamentation, we hear the daughters of Jerusalem who are like mourners for their husbands. The reference to daughters of Jerusalem in a lament are rare. We do hear it, however, in Jesus' lament to the women on the way to the cross. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never suck. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, to the hills cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Like the Qumran lamentation, Jesus' lament borrows from the apostrophe of Isaiah 54, 1-10, "Blessed are the barren." These linguistic parallels and mutual use of biblical texts suggest a matrix of religious sentiment which was marked by its pessimism concerning Jerusalem's immediate future. Jesus' lament on the way to the cross marks a shift from his refusal to require his disciples to embrace the severe example of the Baptist. On his final approach to Jerusalem, he voices recognition that his message would be rejected. Recognizing the dire outcome for the people of Jerusalem, he wept on at least 3 occasions for the holy city. Nevertheless, our saying about the bridegroom represents an attitude which is marked by joy. In Jesus' words, the present period was akin to a wedding where the joy of the occasion precludes any concerns. He did not dismiss the ominous signs of future judgment, but for the present period, the children of the bridal canopy would not be required to fast until the time when the bridegroom is taken away. And that brings us to the pivotal issue of recognition of the bridegroom, the metaphor. In the question about fasting, Jesus sought to justify the distinctive practice by his disciples by resorting to the Jewish recognition of the incompatibility of festive and solemn days. One of the biblical verses used to establish the distinction between these 2 days was the warning heard in Amos 8:10, "I will turn your feast into mourning and all your songs into lamentation." Jesus accepted the incompatibility of external signs of mourning during a period of joy. Yet Jesus' creative innovation was his extension of the principle to justify his rejection of the mournful asceticism of the Baptist and his followers. The question still remains, however, to what or to whom Jesus' metaphor, the bridegroom, refers. As we have noted, the image of the bridegroom for the Messiah is missing in the Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism. Instead, Jesus used the departure of the bridegroom to signal a time when the present situation would change. His saying corresponds to the structure of Amos 8:10 through 11, and following the mention of feast and mourning with the words, "Behold, the days are coming." The frequent meaning of these words in the language of the Hebrew prophets was to signal impending divine judgment. So we also hear elsewhere in the words of Jesus, Luke, and I've given you 3 texts here, I'll read just one, but they all 3 point in the same direction. As for these things which you see, the days will come when there will be not left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. All 3 texts look towards the disaster, the destruction of Jerusalem. The phrase, "the days are coming," recorded in Luke, invariably speaks of the period of the destruction of Jerusalem. Use of the phrase in our saying indicates the context in which we are to understand the departure of the bridegroom. The representation of the bridegroom in Isaiah 62:5 is for God himself. "For as a young man marries a virgin, so shall your sons marry you. As the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you." Yet, mention of the absence of the voice of the bridegroom is used by Jeremiah to signal divine judgment upon the nation. Jeremiah 7:34, "And I will make to cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, for the land shall become waste." The verse is employed in literature of Judaism of the period, whether it's common Judaism or not common Judaism, but of Judaism of the period, to warn the nation of divine displeasure. In the Hellenistic period, we hear echoes of the verse with its complex connecting the cessation of joy of the bride and the bridegroom with the desecration of the temple. After Antiochus Epiphanes ransacked the temple, the writer of 1 Maccabees records, "Israel mourned deeply in every community, rulers and elders groaned, maidens and young men became faint, the beauty of women faded, every bridegroom took up the lament, she who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning." And again, in a few lines later, "Her sanctuary became desolate as a desert, her feasts were turned into mourning." The passive voice in the connection with the departure of the bridegroom in the Gospels has been interpreted by most scholars to be a euphemistic expression of violent action against Jesus, in other words, his death. However, the passive voice here is merely an example of the divine passive. Thus, the use of the passive voice and the phrase, "when the bridegroom is taken away," does not preclude that Jesus used the departure of the bridegroom here to signal God's judgment upon the nation. There is evidence that Jesus was familiar with this literary complex of defilement, judgment, mourning, rooted in Jeremiah 7. On a subsequent occasion, he makes an elliptical allusion to Jeremiah 7:11 in the temple precincts. "You have made it, the temple, a den of thieves." His scathing charge is a warning against the temple authorities. That his intent was not missed by those who heard him is attested in the Gospels. We've noted that Jesus was not the only individual to foresee the coming destruction. A story told by Josephus is particularly important for our purposes. The Jewish historian recounts an occasion when another Jesus, son of Ananias, went into a fit of prophetic ecstasy which lasted 7 years before the destruction of the temple. His prophecy began during the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, this is from Jewish War. 4 years before the war, when the city was enjoying profound peace and prosperity, there came to the feast at which it is the custom of all Jews to erect tabernacles to God, one Jesus, son of Ananias, a rude peasant, who standing in the temple suddenly began to cry out, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against the people." The magistrates, supposing, as was indeed the case, that the man was under some supernatural impulse, Albinus pronounced him a maniac. What is particularly striking is the recurrence of the elliptical allusion to Jeremiah 7:34 and Jesus ben Ananias' prophesy against Jerusalem and the temple. In anticipation of a cessation of joy and gladness at the destruction of the temple, it mirrors the historical record. Josephus recounts that as the war with the Romans ensued, residents of Jerusalem began to mourn, realizing that defeat and destruction of the holy city was inevitable. Quote, of the sober and elder men there was not one who did not foresee the future and mourned for the city as if it had already been doomed. According to the Mishnah, during the war with Rome, public displays of festivity during weddings was forbidden. During the war of Vespasian, they forbade crowns of bridegrooms and the wedding drum. We hear elsewhere in the same tractate that when the Sanhedrin singing ceased at wedding feasts, as is written, they shall not drink wine with song. Since the destruction of the temple, in one of the blessings pronounced at Jewish weddings, the yearning for restoration is expressed in the words of Jeremiah 7:34, Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who created joy and gladness, the bridegroom and the bride. Hasten the day, O Lord our God, when the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem will hear the joy and gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride. Jesus and others living in those tumultuous days foresaw the coming disaster. It would indeed be a time to mourn and fast. Yet Jesus' response in our present saying reflects the general contemporary sentiment regarding national days of mourning. After the return from Babylon, the Babylonian exile, the question had been raised whether the days of mourning commemorating the Babylonian conquest and the destruction of Solomon's temple should continue. According to Zechariah, these days were set aside. The fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th, the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th shall be to the house of Judah seasons of joy and gladness and cheerful feasts. Therefore love truth and peace. Jesus' sentiment reflects the general opinion prior to the destruction of the Herodian temple. It's fascinating, however, to note that our saying's anticipation of a change in attitude and practice in reality occurred. After the destruction of the temple, the National Day of Mourning on Tisha B'Av was reinstituted to commemorate the destruction of both the first and second temples. While Jesus did not ignore the problems existing among the priestly establishment, he still accepted the validity of the temple. He rejected the extreme sectarian critique heard in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their rejection of the temple may explain the mournful solemnity of their lifestyle and that of those belonging to the fringe movements who shared their views. It may also explain the reason for the fasting mourning on the part of John's disciples. Yet we once again see that Jesus' opinions are more closely related to the world of Israel's sages than with the Dead Sea sect. The aim of our study has been to understand Jesus' enigmatic reference to the departure of the bridegroom. In the course of our investigation, we have gained new insight into the structures of thought by individuals and groups living in those momentous days. Jesus' reaction to the question about fasting helps us to understand not only his opinion, but also the views of his contemporaries. We have discovered that contrary to the common Christian interpretation of Jesus' words, the metaphorical use of the bridegroom in our saying is not messianic. While the temple stood and the hope for averting disaster remained, Jesus' disciples would not mourn. Jesus accepted the Jewish principle in his lifetime of the incompatibility of the days of joy and mourning. Nevertheless, like others living in the decades before the destruction of the temple, he anticipated the coming disaster. His saying is an elliptical allusion to the language of another prophet who likewise was unable to avert the coming disaster. Using the imagery of Jeremiah 7:34, Jesus prophesied a change in practice which in fact occurred. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast.
I think we have time for 2 moderate questions this time.
I was hoping to fill up all the time, so there would be no questions, but we will.
If you have any questions, just raise your hand, and I'll make my way to where you are.
They're trying to make sure everyone can hear. Sometimes the question is more important than the answer.
Is fasting always mourning?
No.
Okay. So is he making a distinction between fasting?
That was the
in
that,
case
that
of
was
more-
the general discussion is that the fasting attributed to John's is sort of the general discipline pietistic rite of fasting, and that's why I think it's important. I try to look at all of the elements of the Synoptic Gospels, and I think Matthew gives us a very interesting additional insight when he talks about the aspect of mourning, which again comes up again and again in the description of his movement. I read that parody, the sort of childish parody. It's continually this idea of mourning, and there's a very, in a sense, I'm suggesting that he and perhaps others they sort of looked forward, saw sort of looming disaster or anticipated things were going to, and were, in a sense, mourning and fasting as if the temple was already gone. It's sort of a fait accompli. And Jesus rejects that. In a sense, as long as there's hope for repentance, I mean, Jesus also had a critique of the things that were going on in the temple, but he hoped that his message of repentance, to sort of changing some of the actions and abuses that were going on there, would be receptive, and that would avert disaster.
So that this would say nothing, for example, about whether one should fast on Yom Kippur.
No, there is no question. I don't know if you're asking about Jesus. There is no question that Jesus and any person living in this period would have been fasting on Yom Kippur for them. Are you speaking in the past or in the present?
I'm asking that question. Is Jesus saying anything to his disciples about whether one should fast on Yom Kippur?
On this passage, no. But elsewhere, the Sermon on the Mount, I think that's the interesting thing is you read commentaries basically saying that Jesus is rejecting fasting. And they totally ignore other passages when he says, when you fast. And the other thing is sort of a fascinating thing about this, and that's why they sort of then draw this to talking about that the fasting will begin with his death. One of the things that seems to people have overlooked is we have not one shred of evidence. If this passage is Jesus talking about his own death, that he's being removed, we have not one shred of evidence in the New Testament or in early Christian literature of the beginning of a rite, a practice of fasting that's connected to his death. If that's, certainly the church didn't read it that way. No one reads it as if he's talking about his own death, or at least we don't, if they did, they ignored it because we don't have any record of any fasting in that regard. So I sort of take it in a different direction, but this particular passage I don't think speaks to the fasting of Yom Kippur. One more, I guess?
One quick.
Is it possible to look at the fasting concept as going back to Moses, when Moses was on Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments and literally fasted for 40 days the first time around, and then he goes back the second time around, so therefore it's like a spiritual link?
Not in this text. I mean, we have, of course, we have Jesus, 40 days fasting. We have Jesus fasting. And so we have that, but I don't think this passage this passage is not connected to that idea, so no. At least I wouldn't read it that way, as connected to, I mean, we can talk generally about the whole rite of fasting and the custom of fasting and the spiritual role it plays in its connections to the Hebrew Bible, but in this particular text, I think Jesus is actually speaking to certain pockets, individuals. The whole relationship of the Baptist movement and Jesus' movement is a fascinating one. It's a very interesting one, and in this instance, I think Jesus is drawing a very clear line. I mean, Jesus and John were not in sync on all points. There was clearly disagreement with them on certain issues. And I think this is one where he draws a line and says he doesn't accept it, he doesn't embrace it, and sort of goes in a different direction. Okay, thanks.